Hey guys, I hope you are doing well today. Um, this video is introduction to The Great Gatsby, talking about modernism, talking about the cause and effects from modernism into World War I, and then which ultimately led to The Lost Generation. This is one of my favorite things to talk about and to teach about. I think it's really interesting, and it's a really good example of like us seeing cause and effect, that an event that happens leads to another event, which leads to another event, which kind of takes me to like the big question for this introduction and this short lecture. Um, you are at your house watching this. I am at my house creating this for you. This is a really weird time for us to interact and for me to teach and for you to learn. And it kind of made me think about this question, and it has popped up all over the place. And that is, what are generations defined by? Generations are groups of people that are born in specific time periods, and usually they're defined by something. There's the lost generation. That's what we're going to talk about today, which presumes that there's something that happened for these group of people for them to be defined by that. One of my friends that I went to college with wrote this article called "Which Generation is Handling COVID-19 the Best?" which is kind of an interesting way to think about that, right? We're in the middle of this, and to think about a group of people responding to a crisis or an event in a particular way. And it's that question and that idea that makes me think about the lost generation. What has defined them and what has caused them to be named as the lost generation? Well, this leads us into talking about modernism, talking about a time period that led to an event, the World War I, which led to a generation to call themselves the Lost Generation. This is one of those things where it's like, it's really easy to pinpoint. This is who they are. This is what they're about. These are the characteristics. But it's not, history doesn't exist in a vacuum. It never has. And so within that, there's cause and effect. There's continuity. The lines are not blurred, or the lines are not black and white. They're more blurred. They're gray to see them one to another. So for us to talk about the lost generation, we have to talk about the beginning of the 20th century. And this is really important because this is the beginning of the modern era. And thinking about how generations are defined, there's this big question at the beginning of the 20th century. How bright is our future? With our technology, with our politics, with our social advancement, there's this question at the beginning of the 20th century where people are asking themselves, where are we going to go? What's our direction? There's this quote that I like from Leon Trotsky that kind of fills in that question, or tries to answer the question and the hope and the optimism of the 20th century. The 19th century has in many ways satisfied, and has in even more ways deceived, the hopes of the optimist. It has compelled him to transfer most of his hopes to 20th century. Whenever the optimist was confronted by an atrocious act, he claimed, "What? And this can happen on the threshold of the 20th century?" When he drew a wonderful picture to the harmonious future, he placed them in the 20th century. And now that century has come. What has it brought with it from the outset? So entering into the beginning of the 20th century, we begin with progress, this hope that the things that humanity is creating is going to make it better. We certainly see examples of that throughout the 20th century. For example, just think of like when humans defied gravity and they learned to fly. They created an airplane and they flew. And less than 70 years later, humanity placed their foot on the moon for the very first time. Just within 70 years, we created archaic airplanes, and from there we moved to larger airplanes, to rockets, and to landing on the moon. Kind of look at anything and we can see that there is that kind of exponential growth. There's an essay by Henry Adams called "The Law of Acceleration," which he proposes that moving into the 20th century, we're going to see an exponential rate, and it's going to get better and better. And we see that with technology. We see it with politics. We see it with almost anything. We see that accelerated growth. And thinking about that idea of modernism and Henry Adams' essay, there, because it's changing so fast, there has to be a new mind, a new way to understand a new world of understanding this world. And so modernism, in terms of its artistic variety, looks at that modern world and says, okay, well, it's more complex. It's not going to be black and white. And so we have some characteristics that help us to understand modernism. It's going to be more complex. And so there is going to be a subjective understanding of the world. We can identify this and we can connect with it because that's kind of our own experience, right? We talk about our own truth. My truth is this. I see this subjective experience and it's mine. Art is a great way for us to understand what's happening inside of the world, what's happening within our culture, and it allows us to make sense of it. So some characteristics of modernism as we look at poetry, as we look at plays and novels within this time period, about 1900 to 1950, we have these characteristics that we can rely on to help us to understand. So a sense of disillusionment and loss of faith. When we look at modernism and there's that growth, and we'll talk about this in a sec, there's this event that happens that takes that hope and optimism and expectation and it cuts it short. And so there's a disillusionment of what humanity is able to do. There's a loss of faith in the institutions that we have, a loss of faith in what the machines that we have. And there's this kind of ennui, this listlessness, this disillusionment with modern life, and a self-reliance on the individual. The individual is going to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. There's also rejection of traditional art forms, experimentation with style. The 19th century, especially in English literature, kind of has a defined sense of style, but moving into modernism, there's an experimentation of that style. And then lastly, thinking about the individual, that bold experimentation of style, there's like the inner workings of the human mind. The stream of consciousness is the word that we would use to describe it. And there's all kinds of novels and poems that you can read to understand that stream of consciousness, to see kind of the human mind at work. The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock is one of my favorite examples of that. There's a literary critic that says that when you read that poem, you see that the internal monologue of Prufrock is alive and electric. It is a live brain that T.S. Eliot has written on the page. The best way for us to understand this is to think about the visual arts. How are those visual arts showing us these characteristics of modernism? So before we go into it, we have this progress at the beginning of the 20th century, and there's this break from tradition, and there's a sense of favoring the subjective experience and using that subjective experience to make sense of that reality. It's a really great way for us to compare and contrast kind of the old world of looking at things, of using art. There's kind of some classic definition and then experimentation of that style. We have two portraits that are doing very similar things to each other, but their experience, the art is being portrayed in very different ways. Of course, we have Impressionism. This is a good example of seeing that subjective experience. We have Monet, which he looks at something and he paints it through that expression, through that impressionism, what is impressed on their minds. There's another one. It breaks from that traditional, certainly the Renaissance way of writing, of art or of sculpture, and there's an experimentation of style. Of course, you can't talk about modernism, experimentation of style without looking at Picasso, and really playing with what we consider is art. I remember there was one time my wife and I, we went to MoMA in San Francisco, and we were walking through kind of the modern art collection. And we looked at this sculpture, this painting, and I kind of stopped and I looked at it and I looked at her and said, I understand why this is considered art. I could do this. And she kind of stopped me short and she replied, yeah, but you didn't. And that's kind of that idea, that thought of looking at this style of art is, yeah, it looks really simple. It looks like there's not much to it. And we might think to ourselves, yeah, I could have done this, but we didn't. There's this experimentation of style of mastering kind of what has come before and then playing with that afterwards. Of course, here's another Picasso. Picasso playing with the portraits. And when you kind of look at someone like a flat screen 2D, what Picasso does is he opens up the envelope and he shows you around the backside of that portrait to show us everything all at once, that someone's portrait is not 2D, but instead is something new, some more experimentation with style. This next one, I do not understand at all. This is called Dadaism. And it kind of looks like a collage, kind of takes a lot of pop culture together, kind of puts it on one screen or on one canvas. And that's just kind of it, right? The inner workings, the machine of the modern world. One of the things that's particularly interesting about modernism is there's a sense of anxiety that the modern world is unable to fully comprehend and to explain my own existence. And I think that experimentation, that style, allowing artists to make sense of that ennui, that listlessness, that anxiety is not unique to us now because we're living 100 years after the fact, but it is something that 100 years ago artists were attempting to make sense of. And then, of course, my favorite, the surrealism, right? Playing with imagination, not really allowing walls or borders to be put up within that art. The difference between realism and modernism is realism tries to make sense of the world by portraying art as realistically as possible. There's an absolute way, a definition of ideas, of thoughts, of art, of how to live, what we should live for, and art portrays that within its definition. Modernism suggests that there's actually kind of a relative view of the world, and we, through our subjective experience, attempt to make meaning of it. We even have phrases now that help us to, that shows that we have inherited something from it, right? I think of the phrases like "you do you" or "that's my own truth." That shows us that we have inherited this from the modern authors. Two major modern poets that are meaningful that you can look up on your own. They're pretty awesome. Ezra Pound's kind of the imagist, the modernist poet, and then T.S. Eliot. His poem, The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock, that Ezra Pound says was the beginning of modern poetry, really is this amazing look at the inner workings of a man, an old man, wrestling with whether or not he is at that moment of greatness to confess his love to someone else. There's Ezra Pound in all of his glory, fascinating guy, complicated guy, and there's T.S. Eliot, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, not just for being a poet, but also for being a literary critic, also for being a publisher and an editor, of finding the major poets of the 20th century. Love Song Alfred Prufrock, The Wasteland, the Four Quartets. He is a poet that kind of popped into the psyche and the zeitgeist of the beginning of the 20th century, and really kind of speaks truth into a culture that is unable to find it, unable to access it, unable to understand it, or even to identify it for what it is. So when we think about the lost generation, we think about this cause and effect. The lost generation, right? Who are these groups of people? What are they doing? And how are they writing? The best way for us to think about this lost generation is to think about this timeline. We have World War I, we have the beginning of the 20th century. We have this hope and this progress of what the world is going to do, where we're going to be in the future. And then we have this singular event that changes it, World War I. And this moment of great brutality, of war, of destruction, of death. This leads to a new generation of people that are disillusioned with what the Western world can offer. A big question that we could ask, that the progressives ask in the beginning of the 20th century, is what is humanity able to do? Then we have World War I, and we answer that question. This is what humanity is able to do. It's able to create great destruction. It's able to take weapons that it has used throughout its colonies and now turns them in on themselves and shoots themselves. And we see that destruction, and the things that humanity is able, the things that the modern world is able to do is terrible. It's destructive. And the Lost Generation really simply pushes that away, and it says, well, then there has to be something else that we can do. There's great poetry, there's great art, there's great literature that comes out of this. If you are interested in kind of learning more about World War I, there's this great podcast by Dan Carlin that talks about World War I. There's this really great movie called Midnight in Paris that kind of focuses on the Lost Generation and the group of artists and poets during that time, which is one of my favorites. But going into the modern world, this is the Lost Generation. This is what we're looking at. It's a good look at a cause and effect. We have World War I, the brutality of that, confronting the promises of the modern world with the brutality of what we're able to create. And there's a whole genre of war poets that you can look up that respond to that. I think of A Farewell to Arms. Ernest Hemingway, writing this novel about World War I, he kind of identifies this place of what this is. Before this moment, going to war was honorable. It was courageous. It was worthwhile. But then you experience it, and as you experience it, it's a whole lot of violence and brutality. Pause this for really briefly to read this paragraph from A Farewell to Arms to see how Hemingway writes about it. What I love about this is abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hollow were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the number of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates. Those big abstract things were meaningless and obscene compared to the harsh brutality and specificity of this war. Or here's this one from A.E. Housman. Here dead we lie, because we did not choose to live and shame the lands from which we sprung. Life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose, but young men think it is, and we were young. In thinking about World War I, you cannot talk about the Lost Generation without talking about the impact that great world had on those people. So here's a really brief definition of what this is. The Lost Generation is a group of writers who came to age during World War I and established their literary reputations in 1920s. The term is also more generally to refer to the post-World War I generation. As you begin to do your research to look at this, look at exactly what do they do. It's true. This is a very succinct definition of the Lost Generation, but it's a group of people that were unsatisfied. They were disillusioned with the modern world. They were disillusioned with the United States. They're disillusioned with kind of the Western world. And so they kind of went away. A lot of them moved to Paris. That's where the big artistic scene was. And they just wrote. They kind of experienced their lives. They experimented with their art and their craftsmanship, and they created some great works of literature. But all of it is kind of that disillusionment, that thing that we could put so much stock into, whatever that is, the American dream, the modern world, the hope and progress, the phrase, it's going to get better. Those things that they put stock into no longer existed. And so they wrote inside of that disillusionment. And as you're looking up the Lost Generation, you're looking up artists and poets and writers that are there, keep in mind that this is a artistic community, a group of people that have come together and that are writing together, that are bouncing off ideas together. Sometimes they're in competition, sometimes they aren't. I love this picture of these artists of the lost generation. These people that are kind of sitting together, they're working together, they're writing together, they're creating together, painting together, sculpting together. They're attempting to make sense of this disillusionment. But one thing that's really interesting is we can look back at a previous generation. I opened up kind of this lecture asking this questions. What are generations defined by? That is a question whose roots are in hindsight. It's easy for us to look back at the lost generation and to think, wow, they had it. That was the golden age. That was when art was cool. That was when art was awesome. Or we can fast forward a few generations and look at the 60s, a countercultural revolution, which is very analogous to the lost generation in terms of disillusionment, in terms of creativity, in terms of free love, kind of unabashed living. And we could say that was the golden age. That was the right way to live. That feeling of nostalgia is that feeling that draws us out, that pulls us, and that romanticizes the past to think that that was a better time. But that wasn't a better time. And when we create that fallacy, when we create that golden age thinking, that nostalgia, that's a powerful thing to motivate us to create, a powerful thing to motivate us to chase something that we might not get. That's why Disneyland exists, is because it capitalizes on that nostalgia. The buildings in Disneyland are 3/4 the actual size of what those real buildings would be. And it's all counterfeit. It's all make believe. It's tapping into a sense of nostalgia of something that could have been, but never really was, and makes us romantic to pursue it. As you begin to read The Great Gatsby, think about that idea of nostalgia, that motivating force that causes us to create, to pine, to waste after something, to change our appearance, to change what we want out of life. Nostalgia is a powerful motivation and appeal to get us to do all kinds of things. I want us to close out this really short lecture, kind of thinking about this in this. Think about this question as you're doing your research, as we're beginning to start The Great Gatsby. Think about this. How did the Lost Generation writers portray the impact of World War I? How do you think the themes in their writings influence 1920s society? I'm so excited to read The Great Gatsby with you guys. I'm excited to kind of go through the prospect of looking at the Lost Generation, looking at these authors, looking at this kind of moment in time, and to experience kind of this really great time of writing. A lot of really good stuff. I hope you guys are having a great day. As always, like and subscribe and smash that notification button. As always, happy reading.